Greetings. It's my pleasure to participate in the Pordavud Center lecture series. I would like to thank Dr. Rahim Shaigan and Dr. Marissa Stevens for their invitation, interest, and hard work in making this talk possible. My book, Reign of Arrows, The Rise of the Parthian Empire in the Hellenistic Middle East, published in May 2020 by Oxford University Press in the Oxford Studies in Early Empires series, investigates the rise of the Parthians from migrants on the Central Asian steppe to conquerors of the Hellenistic Middle East. The primary purpose of Reign of Arrows is to create more awareness and further the discussion of Parthia and the Parthians on their own terms, as well as within the wider context of the ever-changing international environment of the Hellenistic world. Unfortunately, our sources for Parthian history are few, scattered, and almost all from a Greek and Roman perspective. Yet the pioneering work of Dr. Arthur Eckstein, Mediterranean Anarchy, Interstate War, and the Rise of Rome, published in 2006, emphasized the potential insights that the theoretical framework of modern international relations theory can offer to the study of ancient geopolitics. Such an approach also offers exciting new avenues of inquiry for Parthian history. Eckstein utilized IR theory as a framework to challenge prevailing concepts as to why the Romans were so successful in subjugating the Mediterranean world, a methodological approach to which my research on Parthian imperialism owes a great debt. There have been relatively few comprehensive studies of the formation, growth, and international relations of the Parthian states, and scholarship on early Parthian history often suffers from what IR theorists call unit attribute theory, which is the belief that the internal forces of a single state determine external outcomes. Unfortunately, such an approach generally overlooks possible external explanations from the larger international environment. Although the internal characteristics of states and statesmen remain important, since the answers to state or unit success ultimately lie within them, on their own they lack scope. States exist within competitive interstate systems, and by overlooking a system-level analysis of geopolitical developments, scholars ignore half the picture. A good example of misguided unit attribute theory in Parthian studies is the notion that Parthian success stemmed from a nationalistic Iranian backlash against the Hellenistic Seleucids. The formation of the Parthian state traditionally has been described as a barbarian, nationalistic slave uprising against Greek masters in an attempt to reclaim Asia for the Asians. Likewise, the Parthians' war against the Seleucids has been described as a nationalistic crusade against Hellenism. And more recently, Iranian scholars have argued that an ethnic nationalism emerged under the Parthians as a reaction to Hellenism. Yet the success of the Parthians was not the result of an Eastern reaction against the rejection of Hellenism. In fact, the early Parthian rulers often were Philhellenes, or friends of the Greeks, and many incorporated this designation into their coinage and titulature. Thus, the nationalism theory to explain Parthian success is inaccurate and inappropriate. Another good example of unit attribute theory in Parthian studies is the argument that Parthian success stemmed from the eager restoration of the image of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Although the Parthians came to embrace much of Persian culture as they occupied the Middle East, they also adopted Hellenistic cultural aspects and maintained a unique identity of their own. Thus, the restoration theory is dismissive and inadequate. Furthermore, there are other problematic unit attribute explanations worth considering briefly. There is a misguided tradition that describes the Parthians as feeble or passive, blaming the incompetence or weakness of Parthia's enemies, especially the Seleucids, to explain Parthian successes. Yet this parasitic theory unjustifiably robs the Parthians of their agency and accomplishment. Additionally, another argument claims that a desire to control the lucrative trade routes between the Eastern and Western worlds was a primary motivation for Parthian expansion. However, the sources do not support this conclusion. Greater economic prosperity was a welcome, although arguably inadvertent result of Parthian expansion, and the sources clearly demonstrate that the political security of the state and the military reputation of the early Arsacid kings principally motivated expansion. Thus, the economic theory misses the mark. Finally, other scholars argue that the Parthians' expansionism and aggression towards neighbors was endemic and stemmed from their cavalry-based army and their need to find more land for their cavalry-based aristocracy. Yet this makes Parthian belligerence appear unique and mostly ignores the considerable outside dangers that the Parthians faced from highly militarized and aggressive neighbors. Thus, the land hunger theory is short-sighted. None of these theories considers Parthian motivations and success within the larger context of the international system of states in the ancient world. Ultimately, the great benefit of applying IR theory to an evaluation of geopolitical developments in the ancient world is that it allows us to gain greater perspective and avoid myopic conclusions through the investigation of systemic pressures within the interstate systems, which affects all state decision-making. Thus, my research finds that the crucial factors which most accurately help explain the eventual triumph of the early Parthian state are the versatility of Parthian society, the innovations of the Parthian military, and the early Arsacid kings' ability to manage and exploit these qualities to the benefit of the state through their capable leadership and dynastic stability. Scholars have portrayed the Parthians as Scythian nomads, as Persian revivalists, and as Hellenistic successors. Yet Parthian society was an amalgamation of nomadic, Persian, and Greek elements. Under the leadership of the early Arsacid kings, the flexible cultural identity of the Parthians facilitated their incorporation of influential Irano-Hellenistic customs into their new and expanded society, while in many ways maintaining the roots of their nomadic past, for instance, their horse-based culture and military. Although elements of their steppe origin were important to the development of Parthian society, the early Arsacid kings quickly recognized the usefulness of adopting aspects of Irano-Hellenistic tradition to support their rule, especially in the development of their coinage, their art, and language. The Parthians successfully melded aspects of nomadic, Persian, and Greek traditions into their multicultural, multilinguistic, and multi-religious society to create a uniquely diverse identity within the Hellenistic Middle East that gave the Parthians important advantages in their competition with numerous neighboring powers. The Parthians utilized their social versatility to establish and expand their imperialism, absorbing diverse and disparate communities into a lasting empire through the consolidation of power under the guidance of the early Arsacid kings and their flexible imperial ideology. Throughout much of the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE, the Parthians came to represent the interests of the multicultural communities of the Hellenistic Middle East better than their Greek rivals. The cultural flexibility of the Parthians helped encourage indigenous communities to support the early Arsacid kings, which in turn allowed the Parthians to occupy large sections of the Middle East quickly under capable and charismatic leaders. The more dismissive and exploitative occupation of these multicultural eastern territories by the Seleucids created local resentment on a scale that the Parthians rarely encountered. Thus, compared to the Seleucid occupation of the Middle East, indigenous aristocrats and communities had heightened regional autonomy and power under the Parthians, with greater access to authority and participation within the Parthian imperial system. A major factor in the ability of the Parthians to establish, maintain, and expand their hegemony throughout the Hellenistic Middle East was the inclusiveness of their society, which the early Arsacid kings utilized to embrace regional aristocracies and incorporate them into a more flexible structure of empire. The Parthian state, from its conception, built upon the social flexibility of a multicultural union of regional leaders under the ultimate authority of the early Arsacid kings. This made the high command of the Parthian state versatile and eclectic, allowing the Parthians to develop a more inclusive system of administration that emphasized, utilized, and internalized the capabilities and strengths of local leaders. The Parthians eventually divided their empire into 18 districts and appointed vassal kings or governors to manage these regions. However, partly because of the limitations of their military capabilities, and partly for reasons of expediency, the Parthians created a more extensive vassalage system to support their imperialism, which generally allowed greater local autonomy and political representation in subject regions in exchange for royal support. Moreover, since the Parthians' professional standing army was relatively small, the Arsacids increasingly utilized their network of strong aristocratic families and vassal kingdoms to raise necessary levies and to share the military burden of controlling such a large imperial territory. This meant that first, as their empire expanded, the Parthians could conduct quick, successful campaigns with their limited military and yet maintain their territorial gains without the need for a costly, drawn-out occupation. And second, during their intense rivalries with the Seleucids and Romans, the Parthians could vigorously defend their territory against invaders with a loyal and determined army. By establishing tributary kingdoms in the peripheral regions of the Parthian Empire, the Parthians also delegated many of the responsibilities and costs of maintaining these regions to their vassals, while preserving a flexible approach to encouraging the loyalty and participation of vassal rulers by utilizing threats of invasion, occupation, and replacement. Thus, the Parthians created a nuanced imperial system that afforded them many of the benefits of direct empire, such as military resources and tax revenue, while avoiding the difficult tasks of provincial administration, management of major urban centers, and frontier defense. This allowed the Parthians to maintain a consistent strategy for Western expansion, especially in the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE, through a network of tributary kingdoms and marriage alliances. This nuanced approach to imperialism significantly aided the standing and longevity of the capable early Arsacid kings politically and militarily. It allowed the Parthians to establish one of the great Middle Eastern empires in history. After the sudden death of Alexander the Great in 323, and the devastating wars of the successors of Alexander from the 320s to the 280s, a new world order emerged across the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. What international relations theorists call an interstate system of tripolarity, or the rivalry of three dominant states between the Hellenistic power centers in Macedon, marked in green on the map, Egypt, marked in yellow on the map, and Syria, marked in light blue on the map, dominated the Hellenistic world. At the tip of a spear, one of Alexander's successors, Seleucus I, created the largest, wealthiest, and most diverse Hellenistic successor state, the Seleucid Empire, again marked in light blue on the map. However, despite Seleucus' success in building a mighty empire, such a vast domain proved consistently and increasingly difficult to maintain for his successors. Tax revenues and war spoils fueled the Seleucid economy. However, the revenue needed to administer the empire and pay the army was a constant source of concern for the Seleucid kings. Although the wealth of the Seleucid state was potentially vast, the Seleucid economy functioned mostly at a regional level, where the production and revenues of each region often went to support that region directly. This meant the regional structure of the Seleucid economy created great potential wealth and power for usurpers and breakaway kingdoms, something the Seleucids faced continually. Further, the Seleucid state was primarily Western-focused. That is, the geopolitical developments of the Eastern Mediterranean were the main concern of the Seleucids. Western wars dominated the attention of the Seleucid kings and drained the Seleucid treasury. Although Seleucus I and his son, Antiochus I, undertook major efforts to stabilize and develop the eastern frontier in the 290s to 280s, the lands of Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan became relatively neglected and marginalized, eventually allowing strong regional powers to exert more autonomy and regional influence. The Seleucids' prioritizing of their western frontier, where their enemies generally used conventional Greek and Macedonian tactics, also meant that the Seleucids' military structure and concepts were not well suited to combat the Parthians' more mobile, asymmetric approach to warfare in the east. Unless the Seleucids were to maintain two armies trained for radically different styles of warfare, their ability to adapt to Parthian tactics and strategy was limited, helping create several opportunities for the Parthians to outmaneuver and overwhelm Seleucid forces. Additionally, communication and travel between Syria and the empire's eastern frontier was too slow and difficult to manage effectively, and Seleucid governors along the eastern frontier increasingly found themselves isolated and threatened by well-organized tribal confederations from the Central Asian steppe. These men gained a great deal of local autonomy and began to think of themselves as independent rulers. Meanwhile, the western focus of the Seleucid state meant that eastern campaigns were costly, dangerous, and infrequent. A major disadvantage of the Seleucid Empire and the later Parthian Empire was that unlike the Roman Empire, they lacked a large body of water to facilitate movement and communication from one edge of the empire to the other. In fact, communication from Syria to the eastern frontier could take multiple months. Eastern campaigns were massive investments of money, materials, men, and time. Moreover, Seleucid kings who conducted years of campaigning in the east left themselves vulnerable, first, to invasions by other Hellenistic states into the wealthy lands of Syria and Anatolia, and second, to internal dynastic rebellion in the form of usurpers to the throne. Only the strongest of kings at the best of times could hold such an extensive and diverse empire together. Unfortunately for the Seleucids, such men were a rarity. Seleucid control of the eastern satrapies declined suddenly in the middle 3rd century as a series of costly wars against Ptolemaic Egypt and dynastic disputes sapped Seleucid strength. In particular, the sudden death of Antiochus II in 246, the Seleucid defeat in the Third Syrian War, 246 to 241, and the subsequent civil war for the throne, circa 246 to 236, damaged severely the reputation and military might of the Seleucid Empire. This unexpected decline of Seleucid power in the 240s caused what international relations theorists call a power transition crisis throughout the Hellenistic Middle East, which temporarily ended Seleucid hegemony and allowed rival states to emerge in Parthia and Bactria. Undoubtedly, Seleucus I had been an experienced and capable leader with an extensive diplomatic and military record. He was the sort of strong central figure that the disparate Seleucid Empire needed to flourish. His rule initiated what we may call the first Seleucid cycle of hegemony over the Hellenistic Middle East, roughly the 300s to the 240s BCE. Yet a series of serious mishaps began to plague his successors and weaken the empire he had founded. The endemic warfare and dynastic rivalries of the successors of Alexander were exhausting and detrimental to the Hellenistic successor states. The Seleucid Empire was particularly susceptible to periods of weakness and decline because of its massive size, and the power transition crisis of the 240s, 230s was a consequence of one of these periods of Seleucid decline. Seleucus I's successor, Antiochus I, lost large portions of southern Anatolia to Ptolemy II in the First Syrian War, 274 to 271. Antiochus I's successor, Antiochus II, fought the mostly indecisive Second Syrian War, 260 to 253, against Ptolemy II to reclaim these lost territories. Yet the greatest consequence of this second war was the dynastic chaos that it indirectly created within the Seleucid state. To seal the peace agreement between Egypt and Syria after the Second War, Antiochus agreed to take a new wife. He repudiated his first wife, Laodice I, who already had borne him two sons, aptly named Seleucus and Antiochus, sending her to Ephesus, and he even married Ptolemy's daughter, Berenike, who also would bear him a son. When Antiochus suddenly died in 246, perhaps poisoned on the order of Laodice, Berenike tried to place her son on the throne in Syria with herself as regent. As a Ptolemaic princess, she called upon her brother, Ptolemy III, the new king of Egypt, to come to her aid. Unfortunately for her and her son, aid did not materialize swiftly enough. Laodice returned to Syria, likely arranged the murder of Berenike and her son, and supported her eldest son, Seleucus II, as king. Ptolemy III sought revenge for the murder of his sister and nephew and initiated the Third Syrian War, 246 to 241, which was a disaster for the Seleucid Empire. Ptolemy campaigned successfully in Syria and Mesopotamia, even seizing Babylon temporarily in early 245. Meanwhile, Seleucus II's younger brother and co-ruler in Anatolia, a man named Antiochus Herax, meaning the hawk, declared independence, causing a major distraction for Seleucus. Although setbacks in the Aegean forced Ptolemy to relinquish his gains in Mesopotamia, Seleucus lost important coastal towns in Anatolia and Syria to Ptolemaic Egypt, which devastated Seleucid prestige and the perception of Seleucid power. Two periods of civil war against Antiochus Herax, circa 246 to 236 and then 229 to 226, proved equally disastrous for Seleucid prestige and power. During the first phase of civil war at the Battle of Ancyra, Seleucus II lost to Antiochus and had to relinquish his control of all Seleucid lands in Anatolia, which Antiochus now ruled independently for several years as a rival Seleucid king. The Seleucid satraps along the eastern frontier found themselves increasingly isolated during this extended period of turmoil. The satraps of Parthia and Bactria had power and wealth. However, the neglect of the royal government in Syria meant that the eastern forces of the Seleucid Empire lost the ability to conduct preemptive campaigns against potential threats, making Seleucid military policy in the east more defensive and reactionary. Moreover, when the power of the monarchy faltered during the crisis of the 240s to 230s, the powerful eastern satraps of Parthia and Bactria decided to break away from the empire, destabilizing the Hellenistic Middle East and overturning Seleucid hegemony throughout the Iranian plateau. This chaos encouraged a tribe living along the southern edge of the Central Asian steppe to invade northeastern Iran with the intention of establishing a new kingdom. The people later collectively recognized as the Parthians began as a nomadic tribe known as the Parni, who in the early 3rd century came to settle in what is today Western Turkmenistan, marked in pink on the map. Traditional scholarship maintains that the foundation of the Parthian state occurred in 250, with the Parthian or Arsacid era beginning in circa 248. However, it seems likely that these traditional dates are too early to represent actual geopolitical developments in the region, and therefore, it is preferable to reject that the Parthian era corresponds to the Parni seizure of the Seleucid satrapy of Parthia in northeastern Iran, marked in green on the map. Instead, a rebellious Seleucid satrap named Andragoras ruled independently over Parthia from circa 245 to 238, at which point the Parni invaded and claimed the region. Thus, the coronation of Arsacids I as king of the Parni 10 years prior to their invasion of Parthia, not the invasion itself, established the Parthian era. With this new understanding, the expansion of the Parni into Parthia occurred after the Third Syrian War and during the first phase of the civil war between Seleucus II and Antiochus Herax, and it corresponds directly with the power transition crisis of the 240s-230s throughout the Hellenistic Middle East. In the early 3rd century, the Parni unsuccessfully attempted to seize the satrapy of Margiana in eastern Turkmenistan. Incursions into Iran and Afghanistan by Central Asian peoples were a continual threat to the stability and security of polities in the Middle East throughout the pre-modern period, and the Parni were simply one of many aggressive expansionistic tribes in the region in the Hellenistic period. Since life on the steppe was unforgiving and tribal warfare endemic, the Parni sought greater security in the region through military measures. The organization of various Central Asian peoples into tribal confederations like the Dahai Confederacy was an attempt to create greater strength and security against neighboring tribes on the steppe and against the Persian and Hellenistic kingdoms on the Iranian plateau. In settling western Turkmenistan, northern Parthia, the Parni came to live directly on the periphery of the Seleucid Empire. This proximity, paired with a lack of diplomatic communication and restricted awareness of power capabilities, caused mounting tension along the frontier and made conflict between the Parni and the Seleucids increasingly likely. Although Alexander the Great had left a large force to occupy Bactria and the surrounding territories, the restlessness of these Greek soldiers and Alexander's sudden death in Babylon severely disrupted the region, forcing Seleucus I to campaign there between 308 and 305. In the middle 290s to 280s, Seleucus committed himself to establishing Bactria as a strong frontier region, even appointing his son Antiochus I as viceroy in the east to supervise the development of firm Seleucid control over this new frontier. Although the efforts of Seleucus and Antiochus in this period created a prosperous and strong eastern frontier, these efforts encouraged aggression from the Central Asian tribes, especially the Parni, first, because attacking these prosperous frontier regions created opportunities to gain considerable status and wealth, and second, because the increasingly defensive stance of the Seleucids in the east generated doubt about the capabilities and intentions of the Seleucids in these regions. After settling in the area, the Parni's subsequent invasion of neighboring Seleucid-held Margiana, in part, was a result of these opportunities and uncertainties. Margiana was a wealthy and relatively urbanized region. Alexander had settled the region with Greek colonies and fortifications, including the prosperous oasis city of Alexandria in Margiana, later known as Merv. The addition of Margiana to the holdings of the Parni would have been a great boon to their regional power and security. Meanwhile, the loss of Margiana would have undermined Seleucid authority in the region severely and compromised the eastern frontier of the Seleucids. Parni attacks on Margiana in the late 280s challenged the regional standing of the Seleucid state and the integrity of its frontier, and therefore the Seleucids had to respond to the Parni invasion of Margiana with force to restore the perception of Seleucid strength in the region, or else risk encouraging further aggression against them. The Parni invasion of Margiana failed, and the Seleucids counterattacked against the Parni in circa 280. This campaign appears to have been successful enough to tamper the expansionistic capabilities of the Parni for a few decades. However, domination of the tribes of the Central Asian steppe was not the strategic goal of the Seleucids. Once the Seleucids had retaliated against the Parni and restored the strength of the Seleucid frontier, it appears that they ended the campaign abruptly. The Seleucids did not completely remove the threat of the Parni, and therefore by 248, a new king, Arsacids I, came to lead a resurgent Parni tribe, introducing the Parthian era. Arsacids was determined to expand the power and security of his people, and it was under Arsacids that the Parni assumed the identity of the Parthians. Within the first 3 years of his reign, Arsacids I appears to have led a new Parni invasion of Margiana, fighting an unsuccessful campaign against the Seleucid satrap of Bactria, Diodotus. At this time, Diodotus's responsibilities as a satrap appear potentially to have included administrative and military command over not only Bactria, but also Sogdiana, Margiana, and Auria, marked in yellow on the map. This was an enormous command with wide-ranging responsibilities, and threats to the northeastern frontier of the Seleucid Empire were considerable. The recent invasions of the Parni make this evident. Diodorus' isolation and expanded role in the administration of the northeastern frontier of the Seleucid Empire illustrates the neglect of the central government in Syria and its continued distraction with Western wars. Although Diodorus was successful in repulsing Arsacids' invasion of Margiana in circa 246, Seleucus II did not send an army to punish the Parni and quash their military ambitions as his predecessors had done. Seleucus II was too involved in the dynastic conflicts of the West. The Third Syrian War had begun because of these conflicts in 246, initiating the power transition crisis of the 240s-230s throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. And the subsequent civil war between Seleucus II and Antiochus Hierax perpetuated that crisis. The eastern satraps of the Seleucid Empire had already endured years of neglect and isolation. This lack of support from the central government, along with Seleucus' contested succession to the throne, the destructive war against Ptolemy III, and the growing threat of Arsacids I, led the two major satraps along the eastern frontier of the Seleucid Empire, Diodorus and Androgoras, to rebel in 245. Here we can utilize the theoretical framework of IR theory, specifically realist theory, to further our understanding of the geopolitical developments of this period. The power transition crisis of the 240s-230s made the rebellions of Diodorus and Androgoras possible and understandable. Appian makes this connection when he records, quote, "He, Ptolemy III, invaded Syria and advanced as far as Babylon. The Parthians, that is, the people of the satrapy of Parthia under Androgoras, now began their revolt, taking advantage of the confusion in the house of the Seleucids," end quote. It is important to recognize that the rebellion Appian here describes was that of Androgoras, not of Arsacids I. With the rebellions of Androgoras in Parthia and Diodorus in Bactria, Seleucid imperial dominion over the Hellenistic Middle East fractured. The decline of Seleucid power in the West in the middle 240s created a power void in the East. Justin captures the consequences of this crisis, stating, quote, "For their revolt, that is, the Parthians under Androgoras, the dispute between the two brothers, Seleucus II and Antiochus Hierax, procured them impunity. For while the brothers sought to wrest the throne from one another, they neglected to suppress the rebellion. At the same period also, Theodotus, that is, Diodorus, governor of the 1,000 cities of Bactria, revolted and assumed the title of king, and all the other people of the East, influenced by his example, fell away from the Macedonians, that is, the Seleucids," end quote. Justin also here indicates that the Parthians under Androgoras rebelled prior to Arsacids I's invasion. In fact, he soon after continues that Arsacids subsequently rose to power by invading Parthia. Unfortunately, Justin confuses the year of the rebellion of Parthia, placing it either in 256 during the consulship of Lucius Manilius Vulso and Marcus Attilius Regulus, or, more likely, in 250 during the consulship of Lucius Manilius Vulso and Gaius Attilius Regulus. However, both of these dates are impossible because, as Justin notes in the same sentence, Parthia rebelled against Seleucus II, who was not king until 246. Further, Justin was unsure of Arsacids' tribal affiliation with the Parni, stating that Arsacids was, quote, "a man of uncertain origin," unquote. Justin's uncertainty here perhaps helps explain his mistaken association of the Parni with the history of the Parthians prior to Arsacids' invasion. However, Justin recognizes that the dynastic chaos that followed the death of Antiochus II and the inability of the Seleucids to demonstrate their power in the East made the rebellions of Androgoras and Diodorus possible. Thus, the crisis of the 240s to 230s threatened the hegemony of the Seleucid Empire throughout the Hellenistic Middle East and made the eastern frontier increasingly vulnerable. With his extensive eastern command and resources, Diodorus likely appeared to be the frontrunner to become the major rival to Seleucid authority in the East. Meanwhile, Androgoras commanded a wealthy and geographically well-situated region in northeastern Iran. However, the sudden deterioration of Seleucid power and the state's inability to retaliate against the Parni's second attack on Margiana in 246 meant that this hereto insignificant nomadic tribe from the Central Asian steppe also had an excellent opportunity to exploit the power void forming in the Hellenistic Middle East. By the early 230s, Arsacids I had recovered from his setback in Margiana, and he was ready to capitalize on the unstable situation within the Seleucid Empire by turning his attention to the isolated satrapy of Parthia and its rebellious satrap Androgoras. After the successful defense of his lands in 246, Deodatus did not pursue the Parni as they retreated from Margiana. There are several possible reasons for his lack of action. First, Deodatus already possessed an extensive command, and the Parni were not the only Central Asian tribe that threatened his satrapies. Pursuit of the Parni would have made his extensive frontier vulnerable to other nomadic incursions. Second, before 245, Deodatus still was acting as an administrator of the Seleucid state, albeit an isolated one. He likely received no official command from the central government to pursue a war outside of his territories, nor any supplies or money to pursue such a war. Third, Deodatus rebelled against Seleucus II soon after his victory in Margiana. In fact, Deodatus' defeat of Arsacids I likely motivated and legitimized his rebellion, allowing him to adopt the epithet Soter, or savior. Deodatus knew that after rebelling, an eventual military showdown with the Seleucid state was likely, and therefore an offensive campaign against the Parni was a risky endeavor, and one that was not worth pursuing while he prepared for rebellion. Finally, although the Seleucid central government was strong enough to punish the Parni for raiding the empire in the 280s, in the 240s the Bactrian governor was not strong enough to do so on his own. There clearly was a considerable difference in power relations within the Hellenistic Middle East by the middle 240s that encouraged the actions of the eastern satraps and of the Parni. Prior to their rebellions, Deodatus and Andragoras were not the most important Seleucid officials, nor were they part of the central Seleucid regime. Moreover, they were not united or allied, rather each fended for himself. The result was a decline in the coordination and retaliatory power of the Seleucid state against the Central Asian tribal confederations. Once Deodatus had repulsed Arsacids I's invasion of Margiana, the Parni became someone else's problem, namely Andragoras' problem in Parthia. Although there is no reason to believe that Deodatus considered Andragoras an enemy, it is plausible that Deodatus viewed Andragoras, who commanded a large neighboring satrapy and who was cultivating thoughts of rebellion, as a potential rival. Ultimately, Deodatus had his own troubles and was glad to rid himself of the Parni menace. The deflection of that menace onto the lands of Andragoras, although perhaps not the design of Deodatus, could not have upset him. Deodatus' unwillingness or inability to conduct an offensive campaign against the Parni, paired with the inability of Seleucus II to avenge the new Parni penetration of the Seleucid frontier, allowed Arsacids I to recover quickly from his military setbacks in Margiana during the latter half of the 240s. Arsacids was an ambitious man with a resilient army pursuing aggressive policies. He was determined to expand his territory and began seemingly, for the first time, to expand southwestward into Iran by the early 230s. This change of strategy for Arsacids reflected the geopolitical realities of the Hellenistic Middle East at this time. Seleucid authority within the Iranian plateau had collapsed with the rebellions of Deodatus and Andragoras. Moreover, Deodatus' defense of Margiana had demonstrated that eastern expansion would be difficult for the Parni without greater resources. Yet the power of Andragoras in Parthia was untested. From his rebellion in 245 to his overthrow in 238, Andragoras' position within Parthia and his influence over his subjects was precarious. For example, Andragoras abandoned Greek coinage, the use of Greek names, and began associating himself with Iranian deities to win local favor, since his position in Parthia had become vulnerable. This was an act of political desperation that ultimately failed, since Arsacids I soon after invaded and conquered the region. External threats to the rebellious satrapy of Parthia, namely Seleucid retaliation or nomadic invasion, were considerable. Arsacids I understood the potential threat of the Seleucids, and by the 230s became aware of Andragoras' vulnerability. In fact, Justin emphasizes Arsacids' fears of Seleucid power, the opportunity that the crisis provided, and the precarious position of Andragoras. He records, quote, "He, Arsacids, who was accustomed to live by plunder and depredations, hearing a report that Seleucus II was overcome by the Gauls in Asia Minor, and being consequently freed from the dread of that prince, invaded Parthia with a band of marauders, overthrew Andragoras the governor, and after putting him to death, took upon himself the government of the country." End quote. Justin here emphasizes the importance of perceptions of power and weakness and the difficult and precarious existence of ancient states. In the years since Arsacids I's invasion of Margiana in 246, Seleucus II had reclaimed most of the lands lost to Ptolemy III in the Third Syrian War, halted the momentum of his brother in Anatolia, and adopted the epithet Callinicus, or beautiful victor. As long as Seleucus appeared strong in the latter half of the 240s, Arsacids was reluctant to invade the lands of the Seleucid Empire, even rebellious ones, in part seemingly because of the threat of imminent Seleucid retaliation. However, after Seleucus' further setbacks in the civil war against his brother in the late 240s and early 230s, Arsacids was, quote, freed from dread, unquote, and therefore emboldened to act aggressively. The natural target of Arsacids became Andragoras' untested and vulnerable territory. Thus, Seleucus' defeat in Anatolia at the Battle of Ancyra, circa 239, perpetuated the power transition crisis in the Hellenistic Middle East, allowing Arsacids I to seize his opportunity to invade the isolated satrapy of Parthia, defeat and kill the rebellious Andragoras, and establish his own power in the region. Another major motivation for Arsacids I's invasion of Parthia in 238 was the dangerous and unstable existence of the Parni on the Central Asian steppe. At the time of the crisis, the Parni tribe had been moving southward and westward for decades in search of a secure and prosperous home. Their attacks on the regions of Margiana and Parthia were not simply raids for status and loot. Their displacement on the steppe made them vulnerable, and therefore they implemented a calculated strategy to create a protected and permanent kingdom within the wealthier, more secure lands of the Seleucid Empire. Under Arsacids' strong leadership, this plan came to fruition in large part because of the opportunities that the crisis provided, and therefore we should not rely primarily on cultural or economic explanations for the creation of the Parthian state, as many previous historians have done. Ultimately, the Parni were not migrating toward the Seleucid Empire simply because they desired to raid the wealthy lands of Parthia and Bactria. Rather, they were trying to gain access to the well-positioned, wealthy lands of the Iranian plateau for protection from violent neighbors, increased state security, political opportunity, and the ability to establish and cultivate a strong power base. The emergence of the Kingdom of Parthia under Arsacids I, marked in purple on the map, in 238, further destabilized the international environment within the Hellenistic Middle East and encouraged Diodotus to declare himself king of Bactria, marked in yellow on the map. Moreover, with Arsacids' defeat of Andragoras, the Parthian aristocracy joined forces with the Parni, which allowed Arsacids to integrate the Parni into the local community and create a new base of power in northeastern Iran that was well situated geographically for further expansion in all directions. Arsacids' prompt conquest of Hyrcania in northern Iran by 235 demonstrates his swift integration of the Parni into the larger Parthian population and established aristocracy. Although some scholars contend that the Parthians did not settle much south of the Alborz Mountains in northern Iran, and that Parthian power remained centered in Turkmenistan until the 2nd century BCE, this minimalist approach is in opposition to much of the surviving evidence. Although the Parni originally centered their power on the important cities of Nisa and Asak, by the time of Seleucus II's eastern campaign in the late 230s, Arsacids clearly had occupied Hyrcania in northern Iran south of the Caspian Sea and the important region around Hectompolos south of the Alborz. Arsacids I's sudden achievements, paired with Diodotus' successful rebellion in Bactria and the recent setbacks of Seleucus II in the west, created an unsettled and volatile international environment throughout the Iranian plateau, encouraging a budding rivalry between Parthia and Bactria. Diodotus, who was a long-standing enemy of Arsacids, commanded great resources and influence in the region, and under his authority Bactria was the leading power in the east. However, Arsacids' conquest of Parthia and then his sudden expansion into Hyrcania made the Parthians a regional power and potential rival of Bactria. The successful efforts of Arsacids to maximize the power of his new kingdom increasingly made the Parthians a threat to the security of Diodotus' territories. Meanwhile, the regional power of Diodotus and the looming threat of Seleucid retaliation encouraged the Parthians to increase their own security through aggressive military measures. Justin records, quote, "Not long after too, he, Arsacids, made himself master of Hyrcania, and thus invested with the authority of two nations, raised a large army through fear of Seleucus II and Theodotus, that is Diodotus, king of the Bactrians," unquote. Arsacids I's successful invasion of Parthia during the crisis, his conquest of Hyrcania, and the expansion of the Parthian army, in turn threatened the exposed Seleucid Empire to the west and the newly independent kingdom of Bactria to the east. The Parthians' efforts to mitigate their vulnerability and alleviate their security concerns through expansion intensified friction with neighboring states because increased Parthian strength and security came at the detriment of their neighbors. For the Seleucids, the crisis had destabilized the lands they still held in the east. For instance, there were military disturbances in Babylonia in 238, 235, and 229. It became increasingly urgent for Seleucus II to address the rising threat of the Parthians and Bactrians to protect Seleucid holdings in Media and Mesopotamia. Meanwhile, for the Bactrians, it was the growing threat of Parthia under Arsacids I in the first half of the 230s that encouraged Herodotus to assert his formal independence from the Seleucids by declaring himself king in circa 238. With the establishment of the rival kingdoms of Parthia and Bactria, tension between the Seleucid Empire, Parthia, and Bactria was an all-time high by the middle 230s as a new interstate system of tripolarity emerged over the Iranian plateau. With Arsacids' invasion in 238, the Parthian state had emerged during a period of widespread crisis. Further open conflict with the Bactrians and Seleucids was all but assured, and the history of the early Parthian state is unsurprisingly violent. Over the next century and a half, the Parthians endured 4 major eastern expeditions by the Seleucids to reclaim the lost lands of the east. They overcame strong regional rivals like Bactria in the east and Elymas, Chorazin, and Armenia in the west. They survived and defeated several devastating nomadic incursions from the Central Asian steppe, and all the while they expanded their domain, developed their lands, and forged strong relationships with numerous allies and vassals until they came to rule the Hellenistic Middle East from the Euphrates to the Hindu Kush under Mithridates II by the late 90s. Moreover, it was under the leadership of Mithridates II that the Parthians finally emerged as a leading power also within the lands of the Near East, expanding Parthian hegemony into Syria and Anatolia for the first time. The terminal decline and collapse of the Seleucids after the 120s created a power void within the Near East, and the Romans were not yet involved heavily in the region, although this situation changed drastically within a generation. After subduing Armenia and northern Mesopotamia, Mithridates II extended Parthian hegemony further west over Commagene, Cilicia, and the Arab tribes of the Syrian desert in the late 90s. And there is strong evidence that his sons even vassalized northern Syria temporarily in the early 80s. With the death of Antiochus X in battle against the Parthians in 88, the capture of Demetrius III in battle against the Parthians in 87, and the elevation of Philip I to the throne in Antioch by the Parthians also in 87, the Parthians achieved the successful culmination of Mithridates' ambitious Western policy. Thus, Mithridates II's leadership and policies were fundamentally important to the identity of the Parthian Empire over the next 3 centuries, but they built upon the legacy of the early Arsacids and the resilience of the Parthians. Unfortunately for the Parthians, civil war and dynastic turmoil plunged the empire into what Parthian scholars call a dark age of geopolitical upheaval in the late 90s to early 50s. And although the Parthians eventually stabilized their position within the Hellenistic Middle East, the end of this difficult period of Parthian history also coincides with the emergence of the long-standing Romano-Parthian rivalry. Beginning in the middle 50s, the regions of the Near East and Middle East once again became the battleground of warring empires. I hope you enjoyed this talk and learned something of value about this much overlooked and maligned people. Parthia deserves to be considered amongst the great civilizations of antiquity, and it is my hope that this talk and my broader research helps bring to light the incredible accomplishments of the Parthians. Thank you for your time and consideration. Be safe and be well.